Hi, my name is Jan Carson. I'm a writer based here in East Belfast in Northern Ireland, where it is absolutely horrible outside today. It's drizzling and it's very yuck. So I thought what I would do is offer you something soothing and comforting this afternoon. And there's absolutely nothing more soothing than soup and nanas. So I'm going to be reading a story today about my nana, Gladys, and her obsession with making soup. Before I got started, I thought I would introduce you to her. So I've got this beautiful picture. This is Gladys, my nana, whenever she was a lot younger. And I'm going to begin actually by reading a tiny postcard story which introduces you to Gladys. And then I'll finish with reading Soup, a story about her. Gladys. Your mother's mother was Gladys, the first syllable of which is glad. This sat sweetly with her face, which was always smiling, always parting its lips in praise. She was born at the smarter end of the Cliftonville Road in a red house with a pitched roof and windows. When the Blitz descended upon Belfast, the windows came in and everyone was under the table praying. It seemed for one long night like the world was ending right outside her front door. She told you this for a school project and how she was sent to Bangor for safekeeping. You had a picture of her paddling in the sea. In this picture, she looks exactly like Anne Frank, serene, striking, miles away behind the eyes. Your Nana was not the kind of girl who worked in mills. She didn't work at all, but married well and stayed home playing piano and knitting. Sweaters were her thing. She knit you itchy ones for school and girls' brigade, a softer yellow number for your 5th birthday. It had a horse on the front with loose strands of brown wool knotted into a mane. It stretched with you all the way up to primary 6. You also recall hats, mittens, and blankets for other people's grandchildren. A cardigan with mother of pearl buttons winking through the mohair like tiny open eyes. Sometimes people still say to you, your Nana was a great wee knitter. Picture your Nana in an armchair by the fire, slippers on, teapot stewing on the hearth. Note the click, fidget, click of needle meeting needle, the way her fingers do the looking for her, the chubby eights of double knit and pink, lemon, and palest blue rolling across the carpet towards the door like tendrils stretching for the light. Picture her singing in time with the stitches, hymns and choruses, romantic songs by Jim Reeves. Your Nana knit until her fingers turned to thumbs and it hurt to pull the yarn tightly. In the end, she forgot what her fingers were for, though they still flew backwards and forwards across the bed sheets, as if she held phantom needles in her hands, as if the stale hospital air could be knit into one last sweater. So that is my Nana Gladys. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is read a wee story called Soups. Soups is based on my Nana. I've created another grandmother figure instead, but it's basically based on my Nana, who, as well as being a champion knitter, also made soup till it was coming out of her ears. Soups. In other towns at other times, my grandmother might have been taken for a witch, but not now, and not in East Belfast, where all the old ladies practice alchemy in the kitchen, stirring their fine magic into fruit loaves, pancakes, and flour freckled soda furls. They charm their victims with kindly words. Such a shame, they say, and you must be feeling dreadful. Or sometimes, when one tragic circumstance has come quickly on the heels of the last, sure, it never rains, but it pours. Each of their words is sounded out softly, like something coated in talcum powder. Oh, but these old ones know exactly how to lure a lost soul in. Mostly they use the telephone, but they are not adverse to cornering individuals in the street, outside Tesco's, at the bus stop, by the school gates with a child keening shrilly in the background. I've an awful eye for the weak ones. Och, now, they'll say at the first damp hint of tears, come on in, sit yourself down. The kettle's on and I've bacon just out of the oven. Nothing fancy, mind, but himself likes something sweet to his tea. Out will come the Tupperware and the family circle biscuit tin, stripped of its original purpose and lined now with paper doilies or Christmas serviettes, crushed paper cushion and flake meal biscuits and shortbread rounds, 15s and butterfly buns, their tiny cake wings rising from the buttercream like actual insects poised for flight. Eat up, they'll say, looming in the doorway with a recently polished teapot. And the weepy one will eat. returning for seconds or even thirds. Afterwards, she'll feel less inclined to mope. Her too full mouth will not have room for it. Her head will run sharp in the quickness of refined sugar. Better? They'll ask, and she will nod slowly, careful not to shower the carpet with crumbs or desiccated coconut. Then she'll rise and stumble home, clutching a box full of well-meaning pastries, something to dip into when the sadness catches up. The East leans upon these women, each one a specialist of sorts. This old one's wheaten is a cure for sadness. Toast it in dripping butter, it'll take the edge off anything up to an actual death. The next one's apple tart works wonder on loneliness. Ideally, it should be served hot and swimming in fresh whipped cream. The other one makes stew in individual and family-sized portions, tailoring her solution to the problem's precise measurements. It is very good stew, thick with just the right amount of runniness. So good it's impossible to feel anything but warmly loved, with a spoonful resting solidly on your tongue. Doubt and melancholy, absent children, philandering husbands, all can be eased, if not cured outright, by the correct food consumed in the correct manner, more being infinitely preferable to less. The elderly ladies of the East hold themselves quietly responsible for all the local ills. They diagnose, they prescribe, they go door to door when an intervention is required. Theirs is a calling, passed from one Elizabeth, Margaret, or Susan to the next. They are all cut from the same stiff cloth, stout of girth and widely hipped, capable of working miracles with an almost empty larder. Do they scrimp on the double cream? They would not dare. Not even on a trifle where the custard could easily compensate for lack of cream. They believe in home baking like it is a kind of religion, and who would knowingly cut corners when it comes to the work of God? My grandmother was the queen of them all. She specialised in soup. Her icebox was a brick wall built of old margarine tubs, each one full of frozen soup. If tipped from their plastic casings, her soup would have formed giant ice cubes in orange, green, and puddly beige, all the colours of the vegetable spectrum. There was no room in her icebox for anything but soup, not so much as a block of raspberry ripple in the summer. Needs must, and she was ready to play her part in whatever soup-based emergency the East might throw at her. Primarily, she envisioned funerals, but a small earthquake wouldn't have been beyond her catering ability. It's good to help a friend in their hour of need, she'd say. This was a nice sentiment. Most people would have said, "Indeed it is, Kathleen, indeed it truly is," nodding their heads in loud agreement. However, my grandmother could not stop with friends. She had soup enough for every sad soul in Belfast. "It's the least I can do," she'd say, and I'd want to reply, "No, it's not, Granny. The least you could do is nothing and give a tenner to charity at Christmas." But I didn't. I knew my grandmother couldn't help herself when it came to soup. She made particular pots for suffering friends, sending my grandfather around with a boot full of carrot and coriander or old-fashioned broth. Broth for a wake, chicken for illness, cheerily coloured soup for a person feeling down. My grandmother had her rules. She stuck to them and would not for a minute have considered offering anything from a tin. "Drive carefully," she'd say to Granda, "and take the corners slow." Soup had a tendency to slop, and the smell of it was almost impossible to get out of a car. A few days later, the empty containers would return to her, clean and often accompanied with a note or "Thank you, sweeties." My grandmother would not label her containers Kathleen Ritchie, though this was a common practice in the East. "Sure, it's only a wee plastic tub," she'd say. "If it comes back, it comes back. If it doesn't, somebody else will get the good out of it." She never left home without a full thermos tucked into her handbag. She made a mean cream of tomato, also cream of mushroom, leek and potato, broccoli and stilton, this being one of her fancier recipes clipped from the women's realm. It smelt like feet if left too long on the hob. My grandmother prepared a different soup for every day of the working week, and on weekends made an enormous pot of vegetable broth, the carcass of an unfleshed chicken bobbling about on its surface like the remains of some poor creature gone swimming in an acid bath. The consistency of my grandmother's soup depended on the mouth which would sup it. Contributing factors included age and gender, digestive ailments, false teeth and lack of false teeth. Sometimes she'd blend, sometimes she'd refrain from blending, sometimes her soup stayed lumpy because the plastic bit of the blender was in the dishwasher and she couldn't be arsed with fishing it out. My grandmother was almost impossibly generous with her soup. She'd stop to talk to sad-looking strangers in the line for the post office and on the embankment where they were only trying to walk their dogs in peace. She was canny, my grandmother, and knew better than to start straight in with the soup. Instead, she'd say, "Lovely weather," or "Wild weather," or "What sort of wee dog is that?" Her speaking voice was like a shoulder gently nudging a door so the sad person would feel compelled to stop and talk. 10 minutes later, they'd find themselves sitting on a bench or public seat, telling my grandmother they did not know how to go on getting up every morning with everything as impossible as it currently was. Often they would be in tears. "You don't understand," they'd say. "It's just so hard." My grandmother would always reply, "Aye, you're right. I don't understand," because she didn't. My grandmother was the sort of woman who'd been born standing up. She had not known major illness or hard loss of any kind, neither had she hungered for food or money. Her eyes were permanently concertinaed from too much smiling. From time to time, my grandfather would say, "She grins like a half-wit in her sleep," trying to insinuate that this was a nasty habit, like breaking wind in public. He was only picking holes. My grandmother was a full-time joy. Grandad knew this. Every time he considered the sour-faced old ones who lived next door and across the street, he'd realise his own good luck. "Your granny's some woman," he'd say to me. "She makes the best tomato soup in the East." This was the extent of his romance. Being of a certain era, not good with sobby talk or flowers, he'd never once taken my grandmother in his arms and said, "Kathleen, you're one in a million." Every Friday night he'd bring her home a Terry's chocolate orange and a bottle of brown lemonade, assuming these items capable of doing the sweet talking for him. My grandmother had nothing to be unhappy about. Therefore, she was happy. She could muster no empathy for the sad souls in the post office queue or those dragging their West Highland Terriers along the embankment in the rain. But she did have sympathy and enormous amounts of soup. "Dear, oh dear," she'd say, "that's terrible altogether, or my heart goes out to you." If it was a sad lady of a certain age, she would pat her gently, up and slowly down like an elderly priest doling out the blessing. She was careful not to touch the young ones or men. It was easier for them to get the wrong idea. "I can't begin to imagine how you must be feeling," she'd say, "but you must keep your strength up." Then she'd go fumbling around her handbag for the soup. Sometimes the stranger refused the soup, always politely with an appropriate excuse. On other occasions they took the thermos and walked away, clutching the dull heat of it against their chests like a hot water bottle. Common sense kept them from consuming the contents, but it was comforting to feel the warmth come creeping through their shirts and blouses. These people, though they never got the full goodness of my grandmother's soup, were nevertheless left with the aftertaste of it, the realization that kindness was still available to them in small, manageable portions. Sometimes an individual was so hungry they'd open my grandmother's thermos right there on a park bench or public seat and tip the slipping contents into the little white mug which sat like a hat over the flask's mouth. The steam would rise off it in white cauliflower puffs, and they'd remember all the simple soups of their childhood: chicken, tomato, mushroom, and without realizing, blow their cold breath over the surface of the cup. This small act alone was enough to lift them a half-inch or two above present circumstances. They'd raise the cup to their lips and feel the soup go swimming over teeth and tongue, down the back of their parched throat, to their belly, which had been waiting so long for a little comfort. Then they'd feel braver, just for half an hour or so, cruising on the kind soup my grandmother had given them. They'd have strength enough to get them up off the public seat, down the Castlereagh Road and back through their own front door, to the trouble waiting inside. My grandmother's name was Kathleen. Most people in East Belfast knew her as the soup lady. They would not have passed her in the street. Last spring, my grandfather died suddenly of a stuck heart. Through the kitchen window, my grandmother watched him slip down behind the lawnmower and lie on the lawn. So still was he, not even a finger twitching. She knew he was dead without checking. She did not cry nor voice any kind of wild grief. Instead, she held her silence like a lap cat and prayed. She sat quietly in the corner of her living room, flicking through the pages of the family Bible until she'd learnt how to hold her mouth like a lost woman. The length of this was around a month, during which she did not make soup. Nor would she consume so much as a teaspoonful of it, though we urged and implored and pointed out the icebox stacked full of every conceivable flavour. For an entire month, my grandmother lived on plain biscuits and dishwater tea. She claimed no appetite for anything stronger. Other women brought casseroles, fruit loaves, sympathy pancakes still warmish from the oven. My grandmother gave polite thanks. She waited till the well-wishers left before passing their gifts on to visiting relations or storing them in the deep freeze, anticipating hungrier days to come. On the first morning of the second month, she rose from her sad chair and made soup. Vegetable broth, cream of chicken, tomato, leek and chunky potato, peeling each peel spud by hand. Her stove cluttered itself with long-handled pots, bubbling and spitting like burst volcanoes. The smell coming off these pots was a holy smell, rising as incense rises towards the roof and the heavens beyond. Condensation fogged the windows, forming watery pools along the sill. The kitchen bench, inch thick with peel and rind, burst its banks and dripped onto the lino. My grandmother stood slipper deep in the mess of it. She raised her right hand like Christ calming the storm and stirred all her sadness into those soups. She used a wooden spoon, a different one for each pot. Grief can turn a good thing bitter. But when it came to my grandmother's soup, it was not grief which clamoured for the tongue's attention. Beneath the nip tart of tomatoes, the smooth blush of cream and buttered mushroom, a softer taste was waiting to take hold. This was a taste like the sound of two sung voices rising in harmony, a taste like the feel of one hand slipping warmly into another, or understanding, or something the recipient was particularly hungry for. This was the best soup my grandmother had ever made. Thank you so much for spending a wee while with me. I hope that was soothing, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I'm going to put the kettle on and have a cup of tea now, and I hope to see you all again soon.